Interpret Europe is an organization with members in 48 countries, which are not only parks, but also museums like the British Museum, the National Museum in Krakow, companies, and many individuals who work, for example, as guides in parks or in museums. And our aim, our mission is to serve all who use first-hand experiences to give natural and cultural heritage a deeper meaning, which means we're not only related to nature, but we especially search to link natural and cultural heritage and work with all which has to do with communication around that. This year, you might know, we entered the European Year of Cultural Heritage. And against this background, we are especially dealing with what is my subject of my talk today, engaging citizens through heritage interpretation. How can we do that? And how can we come to a point where citizens take more responsibility than just to protect the heritage we are dealing with? So just to get a little bit further and to think about the common good. And I think to achieve that, we need to think about our role in heritage interpretation. And to do this, I introduce just one picture most of you might have seen before. This is Yosemite Valley in California, one of the first national parks. You see this characteristic rock formation in the background, half dome. And you see in the foreground a little shelter. And if you look at the caption, it says Trailside Museum. Yeah, so this shelter is called a museum. And some of you might wonder, because a museum, usually we think about something else. We think of lots of panels, text, explanations, graphics, a lot of animation. But as you can see, they said in the 20s, this is a museum. And what this museum basically does is it exposes the people to an original object, which is the half dome. So they trust that the people make a connection to this because the environment is so strong that they think if we place the people in the right place, this connection will come and they will do something with this source. And you might have heard of a person who was a lot doing in the Yosemite Valley in the 19th century. He's actually called the founding father of nature conservation in the United States. And this is a person who for the first time used interpretation for this process. It was John Muir. John Muir lived in the Yosemite Valley for a long time. And he wrote in his diary in 1871, "I'll interpret the rocks." So this was the first time when he used interpretation in this context. "I'll interpret the rocks, learn the language of flood, storm, and the avalanche. I'll acquaint myself with the glaciers and wild gardens and get as near to the heart of the world as I can." So this was what he thought is interpretation, getting as near to the heart of the world as we can. And you see, this is quite good mirrored by this idea to set up a trailside museum and expose the visitors to the original objects and to the sites and let them experience on their own and then come to their conclusions. I will come back later to that because I think this is a very fundamental point. When we were working in heritage interpretation through the last decades, we were not always focused on the idea to bring the people to the things and let the people do the work and let the people come up with what it means to them. We often told people what we think, what it should mean to them. So the main task of heritage interpretation is actually to connect the people to their heritage. It is not to give them information about it or to tell them lots about it. This is a support, but it's basically to connect them. And our question is, how can we achieve this? So what is our role? How can we achieve this connection? The model we usually use in this context is what you can see here, the interpretive triangle, which brings all these points into a row. So we have the phenomena. We call it the phenomena, the original size, the objects, the half dome in the Yosemite. We have the people, and we try to connect them, and we try to find what is connecting all of us, what is connecting the people, the source, and ourselves. So this is what is at the center of this triangle. And if you think what are the qualities included in that, so you see we have three corners, of course, of the triangle, and we have one thing in the center, which means we have four elements. So what are the four qualities that are included in heritage interpretation? We say the first quality is to turning the phenomena, so on top of the triangle, into experiences. The second is to provoke resonance and participation in the people. The third is to foster stewardship for all heritage. And the fourth is to offer paths to deeper meaning. So this is what is at the heart of the interpretive triangle. We say these are the four aces of heritage interpretation. So these 4 points, the experience, stewardship, participation, and meaning, is what we are dealing with basically when we're talking about heritage interpretation. And I will focus at the moment at the center of this triangle, so at the meaning. How does something become meaningful to us? This is the basic question heritage interpretation is dealing with. And you could say that something becomes meaningful for us if it triggers something which is very important to us, which is at the heart of what we feel is essential in life. I put down some of these concepts which we could think are important to people. You see, hunger or family. Family is a very strong point where many people are triggered by. Freedom is something which is very important at the moment all over the world. Loss is a big subject when we are dealing, especially with nature protection and all these fields. So all these concepts you can see here, we call it universal concepts. Universal concepts are meaningful to almost all people around the world. So it is no difference to what culture they belong or where they live. They are important to all of them. This does not mean that they have the same meaning for all of them, but they have meaning. So this is the essential point. And we can distinguish this meaning in different layers. We can say universal concepts trigger frame facts. So if we have meaningful concepts, they put frames on facts. And I explain what I mean by this. You see, if you think about one of such a concept like home. Home is something which does something to almost every person on earth. Home means something, but you can see you can say at the surface, a home consists of what I written here: a house, a garden, a room with table, chairs, a cupboard, some things that somehow belong to home. So we are on the surface if we're talking about home through this perspective. But everybody knows that home has a deeper meaning for us. Home does something for us. Home brings emotions in. And this is when we come to the deep frames. So if we say home has a very strong function. And of course, we can work with this. We can trigger such associations in people. And we can work with this, and we can think what it does to people. And I brought one example here, which is from George Lakoff. He's a cognitive linguist, and he came up with this example to show how this framing, how these frames like home can change actually the politics in the world. He was relating to the 9/11 attacks at the World Trade Center in New York, and he said that soon after these attacks, 1 week after the attacks, the American president said, now we are on war on terror. And everybody of us knows that since that time, war on terror is a very, very important term. Actually, we are still in war on terror, and it is actually the frame we are working with since a long time now. And George Lakoff said, war means that some things go without saying. So we have an offender, we have armies, we have battles, we have guns, and we aim for victory, because this is the narrative you usually have if you think of war. So as soon as you accept that we are on war, all these things go without saying. So it's an automatism which is triggered. And he said, if we imagine that at the same speech, President Bush would have said, We are not on war on terror, but this is the biggest crime that has ever been done, and we are now longing for justice. We would have a completely other script. So crime goes with other elements which are connected to it. There are criminals, there are courts, there are trials, there are laws, and in the end, we aim for justice. So if he would have said this, and if that would have been the frame we're working with, the politics in the world might have been different in the last years. And I feel this is a very strong example. Of course, it's much stronger than what we connote to home or what has to do with our protected areas and what's going on there. But you can see that if you use frames, if we are working with meaning, then we can have a really strong impact on what people do and how people behave. The publication, I have it always in the PowerPoint. The publication is a political mind. It's a little book from George Lakoff, which you can get easily. And the most important book he wrote is some decades ago already, was Metaphors We Live By. So George Lakoff is a lot working with metaphors and framing and all these things. If you're interested in that, this is an important person to look for. So as we realized, frames have always to do somehow with values. What is motivating us? And I put this diagram here. This is based on a very big research on universal values all around the world. There's an incredible amount of data was going in there, so it's not accidentally that this scheme is there. There is a value map leaning behind, and all these different pieces of the circle, like universalism, benevolence, and self-direction, are frames. And within these frames, you can imagine there are a lot of values. So keeping for nature, for example, is a set of values which is much in this first on top universalism piece. So nature is very much related in there, and you see there are opposing values, and you see there is a system behind. There are some very simple rules within this value circumplex. For example, which sounds like common sense. If you trigger and if you strengthen the values that are opposite in the circle, you weaken the values which are on top. For example, universalism. If you want to strengthen universalism, in this case, including protection for nature, but also social aspects, you will not do this if you strengthen achievement or power values. So there are some rules in this circumplex. This is called the seesaw effect. There are some rules in the circumplex which explain how these values work together. That's interesting. For example, in this case, there were studies from WWF UK, and they found out that in their communication work, they often actually strengthen values like achievement or power or hedonism. Like if you bring people into a competition, or if you say you feel much better if you do this or that, then you strengthen actually the values on bottom, and which means in the end that you weaken what you actually wanted to strengthen. So you want to strengthen nature protection or the social responsibility values in the upper part of the circle, and by teasing people, triggering people with the values on the lower part of the circle, you weaken the ones in the upper part. It's very interesting. I cannot go too far in this now, but it's I give you some literature where you can look this up, whoever is interested in that. Another interesting aspect in this value circumplex is if you strengthen values like keeping, feeling responsibility for nature and doing something in this field, you automatically strengthen values that are neighbored to them. This is the spillover effect. So benevolence, for example, has a lot to do with family, and family is the idea of having a family and caring for your family is very close to the idea of caring for nature, which at the first glance is strange. You cannot see this connection, but there's a lot of research going on that chose this neighborhood. And you can see on the other hand, if you go for benevolence, so this is this part, you can see on the other hand that this is very close also to tradition. So it could actually bridge this idea of caring for people, caring for nature, feeling social, feeling responsibility to traditional values. On the other hand, it is very close to self-direction. So if you say, I want to develop myself, I develop my individuality, this is also very close to universalism. So if you can work with these values, and you can think, if we address people in our protected areas in this or that direction, some other things come with them without saying. And this is a very important finding if we think how we can engage people for something that is bigger than making them understand that it's important that we have lots of species in our protected areas, that we want to keep them, and what we have to do for this. Now, if you go for on a very high level and think about this, what I said at the beginning, universal concepts, we realize that such universal concepts are also included in what is important for Europe, what is important for example, for the treaty for the European Union or the Council of Europe's agreements on what is important for the development for our continent, which is terms like dignity, respect, rule of law, solidarity, and so on. So if we like to trigger these values, if we want to go for them and try to strengthen them, what could we do against what I said before? And of course, there's this other question: do we want to do this, and is that our task, and how can we deal with the challenges that are connected and triggering such frames in people? Without question, if you look at a very nice picture, I love this. This is from Italy, Giardino di Ninfa. It's a very nice park where actually nature and culture are closely connected, because this was an early medieval town which was abandoned at that time, and then nature took over. And you see now it's more like an English garden. This was the idea behind. So it's a very nice setting. But you could imagine that the terms I brought before, like dignity or solidarity, and even other terms I brought before, like justice, or at the very beginning, home, yeah, that we could interpret this area with highlighting these terms and putting them in question and triggering our visitors to think about them, what it means against this background. And so we could make a much wider circle than just explaining the area. So this is basically the idea. If we are talking about interpretation, and if we're thinking about what is at the heart, so how can we help the people to find meaning in natural or cultural heritage, to trigger this, to offer some themes that might help them to come to this, and then to bring them to reflect it. So you can imagine, if you're thinking about training people, we have a training program in Interpret Europe where we like to train people, for example, guiding visitors. How can we encourage them to make visitors think about the meaning that is behind heritage? And how can we moderate, facilitate this process, that they come up with different meanings? Of course, different people have different opinions. They come into an exchange about it, and how we can help them that all these things become really meaningful to them. So this is basically what our task is in that. And I feel that this especially is an important perspective for heritage interpretation. For if we want to have an impact in society, if we want to have reach further out of the protected areas, out of museums, then to make people think about the reality, what's going on with them, and help them, and use this as a big treasure of metaphors, which can help them to develop something meaningful for themselves, then I think we can really make a change. I said I was just shortly triggering these ideas with frames and values and what was all behind. And I'm sure this was a little bit like I triggered it, but I couldn't go deep enough. If you want to read more about this, there is some very, very valuable background reading. If you go to a website called valuesandframes.org, you find lots of this literature which you can download for free, which is written in a very easy way, but has all much research behind. For example, you can see Common Cause for Nature is a publication which I really recommend for everybody who says, oh, I didn't get it really, but I'm interested in what is this about with the frames and how can we come to meaning that makes people think and that makes people reflect on nature. Then this would be a very good publication. And we have another one, which you can find at our website at Interpret Europe Material, which we wrote last year, which is actually engaging visitors with Europe's cultural heritage, because this was written for the European Year of Cultural Heritage, where we explained a little bit deeper what I tried to tell you before. All of this was triggered when we had a conference in 2016, which was called Heritage Invitation for the Future of Europe. And we received at this conference greetings from the European Commissioner for Education and Culture, Tibor Navracsics, who wrote, through interpretation, I believe heritage can contribute to the building of communities, not just at local level, but also on national and European levels. Bringing citizens closer to their heritage is about bringing them closer to each other. And this is an important step towards a more inclusive society. So this is a very big frame now. And we were a lot of discussing how we can meet this and whether this could be something like a guiding star for us to go for this. And the publication I just shown you, Engaging Citizens for Europe's Cultural Heritage, is basically about this idea. So how to deal with that. Coming back to the point which I brought at the beginning, I think engaging citizens through heritage does not mean interpreting heritage for them, but encouraging them to search for their own deeper meaning, their own deeper meaning. So this is very important, and it brings us back actually to what I said, what John Muir said at the very beginning. So John Muir was actually not basically a guide or someone who brought people into nature, but he felt that interpretation is his dialogue with nature. And if we can achieve that, our visitors come more into this dialogue again, that they think what is meaningful for me in the parks, then I think we are on a good way to widen our horizon. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.